Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKUSCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shamdasani. In this episode's initial spotlight segment, we'll be chatting with Singapore-based Dow Jones Trade Compliance Product Manager Lucas Har about the impact of China's new export control regulations on dual-use goods, as well as the evolving regulatory landscape shaping international trade and its implications for Hong Kong businesses. Following that, we'll discuss the passage of Hong Kong's new Stablecoin ordinance. The bill was passed on May 25th. We'll also be discussing the distinction between stablecoins and meme coins, as well as virtual asset regulatory developments in the U.S., specifically the Genius and Stable Acts, enthusiastically passed under the Trump administration, with prominent local fintech and crypto lawyer Joshua Chu Melizza Anievas, co-founder and executive director of Women in Web3, a Hong Kong group. But first, the ongoing U.S.-China trade war has meant that navigating trade landscapes and examining compliance and supply chain risk has become ever more cumbersome. Dow Jones' Lucas Har brings his industry experience to bear and will hopefully shed light on the increasingly complicated issues surrounding compliance, sanctions, and dual-use goods given the currently frayed U.S.-China trade relationship, especially in the wake of increased U.S. tariffs on China and Hong Kong. Having been with Dow Jones Risk and Compliance for nearly a decade, Lucas began his career with a focus on anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing research across an array of Asia-Pacific jurisdictions. He currently manages the firm's global trade compliance product suite, spearheading innovation and strategic growth. He is also extensively engaged with financial institutions, corporations, and regulators across jurisdictions, fostering discussions on export control, compliance, and strengthening the firm's expertise in these vital areas. And with that, Lucas Har, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, broadly speaking, how would you describe the evolving regulatory landscape shaping international trade and its implications for Hong Kong businesses, or even those in Singapore and across the region?
Before we dive into that, right, I think it's important to understand the challenges that we face today, especially for, businesses in Hong Kong where there's so much, export-import activities going on. I think, I don't know how many of you have been to Singapore maybe in 2018. So Singapore is usually an uneventful place when it comes to, politics and stuff, right? But something interesting happened in Singapore in 2018. So back then, President Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, they held a talk in Singapore in March in 2018, right? And a lot of people were really excited about, the outcome of the conversation.
I think it was kind of impromptu.
Right.
On the way back from Europe.
Yeah, I think so. And because, there was, all of a sudden, there were a lot of security checks. People were really excited. I think it's kind of impromptu. But what struck my attention that time, right, was the entourage of cars that Kim Jong-un and his folks, right, they were driving. So they had Mercedes, but it's not the type of the Mercedes that you see on a daily basis, right? So he has those super expensive, bulletproof Mercedes, and each of those cars would be easily $1 million US. And at that time, that was when I put on my compliance hat, because I was like, wait a minute, North Korea is a sanctioned country. So how could Mercedes, sell anything to North Korea, right? And second thing, there's this concept of dual use goods. So if something can be served for military and civilian use case, right, like both purposes, then it's a dual use goods. Even though cars, Mercedes cars is not dual use item. But then, with this kind of like high-end cars, right? They have like chips, advanced chips, navigation systems in there. So I was wondering how, they can bypass like international scrutiny to obtain like this type of bulletproof high-end Mercedes cars, right? And I think this is where it got interesting because if you look at the shipping route, like through satellite, right, you will see those cars, they started in Germany where it was manufactured, and then they sent it to Rotterdam in Netherlands. So it's one of the busiest ports in the world, right? Now from here, right, if they just ship the goods, like the cars directly to North Korea, it will get rejected, right? Because people will be able to catch them. So somebody in Kim Jong-un's team was really smart because what they did is, they sent a car from Netherlands to Dalian in China, which is another port. And then from China, it went south to Osaka in Japan, where they have an intermediary. So they set up a shell company, somebody take in the car, and after that, they sold it to somebody in South Korea, Busan, and then to Russia. In the end, these cars they reach North Korea, and this is a long-winded way to highlight the complexity of what we are looking at today, right? Like from a business point of view, there are a lot of things you have to check to stay compliant to international regulations. For example, the people that you are dealing with, whether they are shell company, whether they pose any sanction risk, the locations, like because this transshipment hubs like Hong Kong, Singapore are slowly becoming a common staging area for this kind of trafficking activities. And then you also have like the vessel that carry your goods, and yeah, so there are a lot of things to check. And I think this is how it's become like really complicated. And at the risk of being more long-winded, I think back then when it comes to export control and compliance check, I feel that people were not as anxious as we are today because back then you get away with like a one-time fine, but nowadays, right, you look at the US sanction, EU regulations, or like different APEC jurisdictions, how they look at this, right? If you violate any export control regulations, you are at risk of being sanctioned, by any of these regulators. So from, a one-time fine to being sanctioned, I think the punishment get more severe, and this is when I think people get more anxious about it. And this is also when export control and sanction belong in one sentence.
I mean, we've long, I mean, the run up to the Iraq War in 2003. I mean, I think that highlighted the fixation on dual use technologies, and of course, in for many years there have been similar such dual use sanctions on Iran and North Korea, the so-called axis of evil, as they were termed by the Bush administration. But China's gotten in on the game too, and I guess the question now is what will be the impact of Beijing's new export control regulations on dual use goods?
Yeah, this is a good question because a lot of time we focus on the US and EU, and then, like when you look at China, China used to have this export control regulations that are decade old or 2 decades old. And then recently in December 2024, just a few months ago, they decided to, review the regulations and update the regulations. So they published a new export control regulations and they consolidated the dual use goods list in December 2024. I think the main thing, right, the reason why the Chinese decided to do this is to align with international standards because a lot of things have changed in the past 2 decades, right? So I feel that this is a timely move, and it also streamlined the export control license requirements, the process. But I think in terms of impacts on businesses, whether in China, outside China, is that this export control regulations has an extraterritorial reach. In other words, right, if let's say today I take in raw materials from China, I produce something in Singapore, and if there's something is a dual use item, I'm supposed to get license from the Chinese authority, right? Otherwise, there's a watch list system similar to the one that US has. So they have a blacklist, they have a gray list. If you violate the export control regulations, let's say even when I'm in Singapore, right? I could risk being put in a gray list, which means, it will be more difficult for me to get licenses in the future, or blacklist, which means, all import-export activities with China will be prohibited for me. So whether you're in China or outside China, I think this extraterritorial reach, right, means that, everybody has to screen against and comply with the export control regulations in China.
When it comes to compliance, what are the compliance hurdles companies face in adhering to sanctions and export control regulations? Have they always been the same, or is it just the players have changed?
Yeah, I would say um, lack of visibility is one thing. For example, because we were talking about dual use regulations just now, right? Just to give an example, like, drone, like the unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Like it's a dual use item. It's a classic dual use item. But let's say if you take like Wassenaar arrangement or the US Commerce Control List, and then you manually search for drone, you wouldn't be able to find it in those like few hundred pages regulations, right? Because the way they used to describe it is really, really technical, and sometimes it's really broad. So the way Vasana arrangement would say it is, unmanned aerial vehicle. And then if you just do Control F to search, you would likely miss out, drone. But it doesn't mean that you can ship drone to, North Korea without license, things like that. And I think the other thing I would I would say is, when you have so many regulations across jurisdictions that you have to comply, then there's, regulatory divergence, right? If different regulators have different approaches on different things, who do you follow? I think to just cite one example, because I was talking about extraterritorial reach just now. If you look at US export control regulations and EU and also China, they have different approach when it comes to extraterritoriality, right? Like the US, they are really aggressive. Even if I'm using US technology to produce something, that is also covered in the regulations, right? And then whereas EU are not that aggressive. So EU only focus on things that are actually getting out of EU, right? Like physically, geographically. And then China also has their own territorial reach, right? So if, like I mentioned just now, if I produce something, dual use goods outside of China using raw material in China, I am supposed to get the license from China as well, right? So with this, I'm just thinking of an example. Like if I'm a company in the EU with Chinese subsidiaries, do I follow the EU rule or the Chinese law, or the US law if I'm using US technology to produce something? So with all this like regulatory differences and divergence, I think it's making businesses really, really challenging for businesses to stay compliant across jurisdictions.
Now, when it comes to due diligence and risk mitigation, I mean, is there any tips you could offer people in terms of best practices for enhancing due diligence procedures to mitigate trade-related risks?
Yeah, I think step one is definitely, internal training, like get your staff educated about like different jurisdictions, different regulations to stay compliant. I think one example is, the US last year, they released like 50 harmonized system codes. So these are the customs codes. And then they are telling you, hey, you cannot send any of the goods with these codes to Russia and Belarus, right? And I think we saw like a few times, right? Like across different countries, right? We saw like how commercial team could misclassify the HS codes for different reasons. And then it might become a hit with those on the US list. And then this companies are at risk of being penalized, right? Even though this is not actually the goods. So I think internal training to avoid misclassification and to ensure compliance is important. um Another thing is also, you have to constantly review the entire like trade process, right, to ensure like at every checkpoint you are compliant, right? So you check the goods, like whether it's controlled, whether it's restricted, the counterparties, buyers, sellers, importer, exporters, whether they pose any sanction risk, the vessel, the ship that like carry your goods, whether it pose any sanction risk, whether it's doing what it tells you to do, right? If you are shipping diamonds, but then you look at the ship, it's an oil tanker, then you know, hey, it's something is suspicious, right? This is when you should flag it. You should say, hey, like is something wrong here, right? So I think this has something to do with improving your compliance framework and also internal training so that your staff is capable of, detecting anything suspicious. And lastly, I think you have to make sure that internally the data that you have is of good quality, and also using the right like screening tools and solutions and algorithms to ensure that you go beyond like the traditional name screening so that you get the right results so that you can investigate.
That's true. The much more is expected nowadays beyond just traditional name screening. But when it comes to, if we change the focus now to companies in the Asia Pacific, when it comes to what are the implications of the present regulatory landscape for regional companies operating at the crossroads of international trade? Now, clearly, those that are more engaged in international trade have more to worry about. I was thinking about it from a, FCPA, anti-corruption standpoint. It's long said that companies, Hong Kong and Singapore companies, are reasonably well behaved in their own home jurisdictions. But once they go out of those jurisdictions, they tend to go wild. If they're operating in places like Africa and, Cambodia, Laos, uh, Burma, the Philippines, what have you. So what are your thoughts? I mean, I know it's a macro level question, but what would be your best advice for them?
Yeah, like at the risk of repeating myself, I think, it's important to ensure that you have the compliance framework, not just within your home country, right? But, across the world, like wherever you have business operations in, right? So I think that is very, very important. And I think at some point of time, I feel that people need to understand, like the importance of compliance. You have to have this realization, right? And sometimes you have to, where possible, you probably have to seek like legal advice from, experienced export control lawyers, because across different jurisdictions, there are a few things you have to, comply with, right? And so I think, having like strong compliance framework, seek legal advice, leverage on technology, all these are very important. But I think deep down, most importantly, people need to have this realization that, this is the right thing to do. And I think this is an opportunity to position yourself as a reputable, credible company that stay compliant, right? Instead of, like finding loopholes, because I feel that like, in a few months time, or the next few years, right, when you look at like businesses, you will be able to tell easily which businesses are compliant, and then therefore it's more reliable. And I think this is how people will make business decision like based on this. So I think this is the right time to position yourself as a credible and reliable company.
In the limited time we've got left, any closing remarks? Anything you feel we didn't discuss? Any thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
If there's anything, like really review different points in your like trade documents. So they different data points, the goods, the vessel, the trade counterparties, and the destinations. I think those are the most basic one. If I can share one key takeaway today.
Well, that's terrific, Lucas Hart. Thank you,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll be right back. And we're back. With us to discuss Hong Kong's new stablecoin ordinance, the bill of which was passed on May 25th. The issue, we'll also be discussing the issue of meme coins and stablecoins and the ever evolving global landscape of virtual assets with Joshua Chu and Melizza Anievas. Josh is a prominent Hong Kong lawyer in all matters fintech and crypto, as well as a prolific writer. His opinion and insights are much sought after by the local press and correspondents of major foreign news organizations operating in the city. You can often hear him at his most candid, in fact, on radio at RTHK. He's also the co-chair of the Hong Kong Web3 Association and a legal advisor to the Hong Kong Blockchain Association. No less accomplished is Melizza Anievas. She's co-founder and executive director of the Women in Web3 Hong Kong group. Under her leadership, the group has grown to over 1,500 members and secured over $300,000 in sponsorships within the past year. That includes long-term partnerships with juggernauts in the tech space, such as Google, Hong Kong, The Sandbox, and Animoca Brands. A Web3 veteran since 2019, Melizza excels at devising growth-driven strategies and operating hyper-growth businesses. Now to the topic at hand. On May 21st, 2025, Hong Kong's Legislative Council passed the Stablecoin Bill, now the Stablecoin Ordinance, creating a formal licensing regime for fiat-referenced stablecoin issuers. While local in implementation, the regulatory milestone decisively places Hong Kong in a broader Asian effort to shape the future of legitimate, rules-based, decentralized finance, or DeFi, as it's better known, and tokenized financial infrastructure. The move came just a day after the U.S. Senate passed the Genius Act. Hong Kong's move in that regard adds momentum to global harmonization around stablecoin regulation, directing the policy debate more towards how to develop trustable digital asset ecosystems with practical, real-world utility and functionality. The city's new framework requires any issuer promoting fiat-backed stablecoins to the general public locally to be licensed by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the banking sector regulator, and the city's de facto central bank. And with that, Josh and Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, Josh, I guess I'll throw my first query to you. I mean, you're a practitioner. You've been at this for a while. I mean, what, why, in your words, does Hong Kong stablecoin bill matter, and what are the implications for, I guess, the growth of finance policy and regulatory compliance?
Well, one of the first key issues that a lot of these regulations that has resulted in a lot of these regulations is actually going around the common theme of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. In fact, a lot of the controversies in the early days is how a lot of people out there have been giving the incorrect representation, saying that crypto is basically a way around these measures. And the newest sets of legislation is really Hong Kong aligning themselves to international standards. And the standards are, if you look across various jurisdictions, because I've been teaching a class on that actually recently, it's more or less the same because the legislative agendas are actually set by international groups like the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, or IOSCO, which really basically had the initially we had the first regime that came out saying how we can regulate virtual assets trading platform. And actually, the next thing that they wanted to basically bring into a regulatory framework where people can have clarity was stablecoin. So it's just basically seeing the next evolution in a lot of the legislative agenda that has been long been set internationally in order to basically align with these standards. And keeping in mind AML-CTF standards that FATF is actually actively pursuing are actually set by the United Nations resolution passed back in 2001 at the heels of 9/11. And we're basically just seeing how these laws are maturing into this space.
So, with that in mind, why is it important to distinguish between to distinguish and define the differences between meme coins and stable coins? I mean, we're getting reports about how the Trump family violated the rules that shortly before the president's second inauguration in January, that they well, essentially they made off with billions thanks to the issuance of their meme coin, and that has tarnished the well, meme coins had issues going back before this, but why is it key to point out the distinction between meme coin and stablecoin? Because neither can be looked at solid investments in the absolute sense. Both carry risk, right?
Actually, I wouldn't say any of them are investment products, right off the bat. And you have rightly pointed out the Trump token along a number of token projects have attracted a lot of controversies if we're looking at the regulatory landscape in the US, because since the new administration have came into office, the regulators have really took a U-turn in terms of regulatory agenda that's quite opposite from the previous administration, and it really have far-reaching impacts into the entire ecosystem. Now, meme coin really came into prominence towards really last year, 2024 to 2025, even though it has existed quite long before then. But we have had a number of high-profile essentially pump and dump schemes that really had a lot of people looking into it. So we can circle back into this discussion because it's a completely separate issue that attracts it. Uh, of course, we see a lot of what seemingly influence into that whole space because of the fact that, well, it's very helpful if you have presidential immunity to basically create these tokens, but it doesn't mean that it has no risk. And the SEC have actually recently just gave out circular saying meme coin is fine as long as you declare quite clearly at the beginning that it has no value whatsoever. Retrospective justification if you ask certain circles, of course, but we'll see how that continues to develop. Now, on the other hand, stablecoin is actually not to be confused, of course, again, as an investment product. If you think about it, stablecoin was actually created by a group of entities that were based here in Hong Kong, which is why I say it's actually a homecoming event for us to actually be one of the first jurisdictions to have the regulatory framework for stablecoin. Stablecoin was envisioned back in the day by one of my clients actually. When in the early days crypto trade, you see a lot of volatility because if your trading pair is Bitcoin and Ethereum, you don't know at the end of the day if you're winning or losing. And stablecoin is actually what we call fiat reference currency tokens. Which is a lot of people are holding onto it as long term, which is not the point again. It's basically a way for you to trade crypto because it's an end-to-end solution on one hand. At the same time, it basically guarantees you a way of having a way of redeeming those tokens so that you'll be able to redeem it into $1. And this is actually something important to understand when you are looking at the regulations as well. The reason why it needs to be there needs to be sufficient reserve and completely backed is so that in the event that there's a large liquidation event like a bank run, people will not be left hanging. Again, stablecoin at the end of the day, the concept is basically if you're holding onto it, you should be able to have it exchange for whatever currencies that you have. Now in Hong Kong, we made a very clear distinction saying stable coins are not to be confused with central bank digital currencies either, which is an entirely different animal to begin with. And if you're looking at various movements across China and internationally, that will probably be an indication of what might be legislated in later on. I would just conclude this part by saying that Hong Kong is very unique because we're actually having a set of laws that cater to both the stablecoin ecosystem, which is really catered to the Web3 trade, as well as having a mechanism in place, or at least a framework foundation in place, where we can also interact with CDBC based jurisdiction. These includes the European Union, China, and ironically, the latest country that actually joined the CDBC chat is actually North Korea. But that's a discussion for another time.
Okay. I'd like to come back to something you said about the SEC clarifications
Yes.
on meme coins. And how might they influence legal risk and compliance strategies for developers and investors alike?
Well, as JD fans have highlighted, the Trump family or the Trump administration really said no to regulating crypto. That's why JD fans actually said they fired Gary Gensler, whatever that might actually imply. But if you look at the greater economics of things, all the Trump family's ties with crypto is really surrounding the World Liberty Project company that they have. And if you look at what they intend to do, they intend to do a number of interesting things, like having their own stablecoin. And if we look at the Genius Act or even the regulatory regime in the US, we see a lot of incumbent stablecoin operators saying it's been a tough year for them, notwithstanding the fact that the new administration is supposed to be extremely crypto friendly. Potentially until the point that there's a conflict of interest or you're seen as a competitor. Again, we're seeing the same thing. They dropped the case against Ripple. Interestingly, Ripple is part of one when Trump announced that there'll be a crypto reserve. He did mention XRP, particularly in his tweets. And two, there are, of course, potential exposure. But then again, you saw, even though the SEC say things like, oh, staking is now legal in the US, they came back and only earlier this week and said there are concerns about approving the Ripple ETF because of staking. So again, we don't know what are the unseen forces moving behind the scene. There might be influence. Of course, I'm sure Melissa will love to jump into comments up to this stage.
Yes, Melissa, your thoughts. I mean, you're a lawyer by training, but an entrepreneur and a strategic advisor too. What's on your mind?
Well, what I'm observing right now from a purely web Web3 strategist point of view, notwithstanding the legal implications of whatever is going on, it it seems that over the last couple of years, whenever there is an increase of a use of a certain type of token, whether that be NFTs or meme coins, there will be a demand to try to regulate and understand this. And I think um this is just the government's or the different institutions' way of trying to understand what everybody is getting into from a financial and investment point of view and looking into how they might leverage on this kind of action too. There are so many different Web2 companies, so to speak, that are carving out Web3 divisions within themselves just to understand and be part of the wave in their own way. Last year during FinTech Week, HSBC unveiled the tokenized gold, and that was quite a headline at the FinTech Week. So I do see more clarity at some point with regards to how these different tokens are going to be scrutinized and used in what are different benchmarks. Hopefully, there will be an international benchmark where the other economies can then adopt to their own. But as of this point, it seems to me that outside of Web3, there's still a lack of practical clarity of how this can be really put forward, bearing in mind that there are going to be capitals and asset managers that also want to hedge on crypto as a form of diversified investment portfolio tactics as well.
Well, I just add on to what Melissa said. Whenever there's significant interest in a particular type of token issuance, one of the reasons why it usually becomes a magnet for regulatory action or regulatory scrutiny is because there will always be bad actors that take advantage of that particular hype and cause a lot of loss and suffering to a number of people. For example, wherever the Argentinian president that was implicated in being involved in the rug pull event, in relation to a meme coin that he was promoting. Then earlier this year, we had the Hawk Tour girl making her own token, and the price of that token went Hawk Tour, literally. And a lot of people suffered losses. And what happens when people suffer loss? They go and complain to the regulators, and that's why regulators have to come in and look at if there's any contravention. Then again, you see the same thing happening to the Trump token. Of course, given the power dynamics, you have other things happening, and all these when you put all these together, you suddenly have a situation where people are demanding clarity. But again, if your regulatory regime is so easily influenced by politics, jurisdictions like Hong Kong, I am biased in favor of Hong Kong, just to declare right off the bat because I'm based here in Hong Kong, but a lot of liquidity might actually flow to jurisdictions like Hong Kong because of what appears to be more stability, how the regulations are developed at the backdrop of FATF agenda instead of the whim of whatever the head of state might be involved with. These are all things that are quite, these are all nuances that will be quite interesting as we see how regulatory framework are developed across various jurisdictions.
Thanks for that, Josh. Melissa, I'd like to come back to something you said about how there are many, essentially, that there are many Web 2.0 firms that are, burning up, trying to come to grips with Web 3.0, and I guess that's something that we've touched upon on the show in the past, that um, the average person, even people I think that are reasonably tech savvy, they're not cognizant of what was the transition between Web 2.0 or 3.0. Has it occurred? Is it some point in the future? What was the what is the nature of the transition? What was the nature of the transition? What are the implications? What will it mean for them? Because from my vantage point as just a layperson, the the average person has used whatever incarnation of the internet in whatever age without regard to such concerns. And it's like, okay, fine. The technology just got better as time went by. And people expect that. There is this expectation in the linear notion of progress, not reasonable, because that rule hasn't always, that general rule hasn't always held good. But you see what I'm saying? Many people aren't even cognizant of what is the transition between Web 2.0 and 3.0. What does it mean? Again, has it taken place? Has it yet to take place? And if it's some point in the future, how do we need to prepare for it?
That's a really good question. I got off a different conversation with New Campus, which is um, a learning platform and group centered on upskilling, and they very recently announced their cooperation with Open Campus in Hong Kong, and they are bringing Web3 education to their students. And one of the big themes that I discussed during that conversation was the transition between Web 2 and Web 3, what that really means. And I do enjoy this question quite a lot because I do get it quite often when people ask me what even is Web 3, and from that point on, what is Web 2 and what is Web 1, what's Web 0. So my analogy for the transition is kind of like taking it back to when we first had CDs. So the first version of the web was purely for consumption. So I would say that is a read version of the development. Web 2 is when we started to have blogs and social media, where we started to contribute to what is being consumed in the day-to-day internet life. And I call that Web 2.0 because you can read and write at the same time. For Web 3, it's going even deeper as to how the data is being used. So I would say that's a read, write, and own. In the sense of Web 3, the ownership could be the ideas, could be the contracts, could be the tokens, and anything that is attributed to that token. So that's how I make an understanding of what the transition looks like. So we are entering a stage where not only are we creating a lot of content and consuming a lot of content, we're moving towards an age where there is now a demand and there is positive feedback from the general public about how they can fully own their data without it with minimal third party intervention and third party control, which is where we have this conversation about decentralized exchanges and centralized exchanges and the choice between going through KYC or having a fully anonymous profile and wallet and figuring out how to cash out at a later stage, probably very complicated and convoluted, but in the name of privacy, they will end up doing that. I think for the layperson, Web3 is very interesting. It's very dynamic. It is a very fun world. There's a lot of whimsy and a lot of innovation that goes into
And
Web3.
some have even suggested there's a difference between Web 3 and Web 3.0, and only those the true aficionados would pick up on that subtle difference, which is key. Which again, to the average person, these are terms, these are labels. They mean nothing. I mean, take me from DOS to the graphical user interface. That I can understand. That makes a practical difference in my life in terms of how I engage with a computer. But these terms and the nomenclature, um, I think it's above a lot of people's heads.
And that is precisely one of the pain points of Web3 as an industry and as a culture. And at the same time, Web3, I might be getting this wrong, but I would put it out there that my understanding of what Web 3.0 means is the infrastructure and the technology and the developments behind it. Web 3 itself is a culture. I've always preached it as a culture and a movement in which more and more people want to have ownership over their assets, over their information, over their own data. And I agree, there are way too many jargons and terms that have to go into being part of Web3 that it makes it not as welcoming for other people to get involved, even if it is just a simple act of opening a wallet so that you could play a game or make a simple trade. That's always been a problem. And I think as marketers and people who work in content, we're constantly trying to translate this very high-end technology, very complicated world into something that's easy to digest. That's one of our tasks. And the other task is that how do we even demonstrate that it is easy? Because sometimes it really isn't. So then how do we remove that fear from other people?
Well put. Well put. I'd like to turn to, what are the key operational regulatory challenges stablecoin issuers face under Hong Kong's new licensing regime? Josh?
Well, we're still since the passage of the law, of course, we had the sandbox for a while, and now we are basically in a further consultation period. So the regulators are, of course, still absorbing a lot of information from it. But the biggest issue, of course, is liquidity, because whether Hong Kong is large enough markets to attract off these these issuers to come to Hong Kong just to get a license is one thing. And of course, the lack of legal talents that know what they're doing in terms of applying for licenses. Just look at the VATP licenses, for example. The advice consultancy that I had with ProSynergy, we did 80+% of all the application. Not a single application that was tendered was done by a law firm in the market, which shows really a knowledge gap. So people knowing who to issuers again, knowing who to turn to, and having reliable sources is going to be an issue. And of course, it's always about adoption. There are way too many different type of currencies out there. Now, if you look at this in combination with also the Genius Act that has also been asked, the Genius Act is actually something that you look at that's quite onerous, is because they have roped in saying anything that references the U.S. dollar, for example, will have that extraterritorial effect. That they will have to bring it under regulations. So we're going to see a lot of long arm and cross jurisdictional competition issues coming up in the coming days.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up the Genius Act. Let's get into the state of play in the U.S. How might the Genius Act and the Stable Act reshape the U.S. stablecoin market and influence global regulatory approach? I mean, you alluded to, the traditional extraterritorial approach that the SEC has taken, and now the fear is this is going to apply to virtual assets as well.
Now, this is going to be a geopolitical angle that I would love to see how Melissa will weigh in after I gave some comments. Essentially, we're seeing the setting of the stage for the next phase of operators, right? A lot of the issuers, there's one thing about facing client-facing and regulatory-facing representation. Then there's, of course, the vested interest issues that might come. Like, for example, even though Trump is not directly involved with world liberty, his whole family is very heavily exposed to it. They have made billions of dollars out of it, and one of World Liberty's aim is actually to be diving into stablecoin. That's in fact, it's ironic because when World Liberty was announced, it was actually the day after the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. So apparently, seeing your life flashing behind your right in front of your eyes, you of course spend what is most important, your next moments, what is most important to your life, which is, in this particular case, selling crypto. That having been said, will
And
the Genius
as silly as that sounds, there are true believers who bought into that, and that created a market of its own.
Yes, absolutely. Now, that having been said, whether the Genius Act and Stable Act might end up having the effect of forcing out some of the longest running incumbents within the stablecoin space, we don't know yet. Will the World Liberty in a stablecoin eventually take up a huge market share of US dollar reference stablecoin? We don't know. And that's why in Hong Kong, even though we've passed the stablecoin ordinance now, some of the projects, I can't take too much deep dive into it, is already talk about referencing other currency other than the US dollar, because the last thing they want to do is go through the whole process and then end up saying, you're actually under the long arms of the Genius and Stable Acts as well, just because you have as a US dollar reference token. Of course, I've been doing a lot more geopolitical pieces lately, and it's that's why I see it's not just a legal issue. And another issue, a lot of times people, when they get professional advices, they only focus on the law, which is perfectly okay, but you have to look at the compliance aspect, the operational aspects. I've seen application fail handled by others because it's not operable, the whole thing, that when they churn it out.
Melissa, your thoughts?
To respond to that, since Joshua, you've covered quite a lot of the regulatory and geopolitical stance here, I can come in again from the Web3 cultural point of view and how the general attitude towards regulations have been. So, one thing that quite a lot of us have observed this year is when it was announced that Trump was going to take office in the US, there was a lot of excitement because that would mean a boom in crypto again and
many have rightly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but many have rightly said, and we had Henri Arslanian, the doyen of crypto, on the show some time back after the election. And the general consensus seems to be this is literally the election that, if not crypto bought, crypto heavily shaped. Imagine this: people taking bets, hedging their bets, placing bets on whom they think is going to win, and then voting accordingly in that direction. And he said literally, there still are people who are one-issue voters, and for them, crypto was it, because so much of their lives, so much of their finances are devoted to it, that for that segment of the population, that the horrid treatment they feel they received under the Biden administration of basically note everything inevitably forced them into the Trump camp. And that shaped the outcome of the election, because crypto has real purchasing power now. And again, economic power gets translated into political power.
Now, I would actually go on and correct. Crypto, at the end of the day, there's still huge issues about the speculative element. For example, a lot of crypto bros have been actually pushing the whole narrative, which I think is quite misleading, saying that Bitcoin is just like the US dollar because of something called perceived value. And this whole narrative is actually incorrect. One, no one owned Bitcoin. The whole concept is decentralization, which is why it was so attractive. But at the same time, the US dollar, on the other hand, had full faith and credit clause. That means if sovereign government like the US defaults on its obligation, then you get to have something called austerity, meaning you can auction off infrastructure. That multi-billion dollar aircraft carrier can be auctioned off to meet those obligations. You don't see that in Bitcoin. What happens if Bitcoin crash, right? Because it's decentralized, no one is going to take ownership of it. So that's why it's such a risky proposition. Now, if you want to have the geopolitical angle on top of it, I always say it's great to have a crypto-friendly administration in town in any country. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people actually say we wish it was from a more normal presidency, perhaps, because of the mere fact that by highlighting
Because temperament makes a difference.
exactly, and you just because yes, the U.S. is an important player, say they want to have a crypto reserve, it also but at the same time, if you look at factoring other things like tariff wars that he's waging against the entire world, suddenly that crypto reserve that you see in the U.S. might become a very tempting target for countries that might see it be in a trade war, and they don't want to use reciprocal tariff as a way of retaliating. Uh, just look at what happened when China had the DeepSeek moments, where that single announcement wiped off trillions of dollars from the U.S. tech market. The stock market crashed quite substantially, made histories in terms of correction. What happens if countries such as China or the EU say, we are investing $1 million to achieve quantum computing that might break Bitcoin? That is going to have reverberating effect on crypto pricing as well. So these are all huge issues that are really more on the geopolitical sense than the legal sense that you will see going into the future. And look, these countries might be retaliating because of a trade war that is unwanted. And if crypto price crash, so too does that support base for the current administration evaporate. So these are all wildcard factors that makes 2025 very interesting.
Melissa, your impressions?
I think what we can see this year is that not only not only can we see how easy it is to wipe out so much stock share, and um, how easy it is to shift the narrative entirely in favor of one camp over the other. It, this year, I think we could really see that even if there are announcements about regulatory clarity, or there's going to be a certain type of act where there would essentially end up having people who hold Bitcoin and other assets have them be more accountable, and maybe safeguard a lot more interest. That it isn't a hard and fast rule, and it isn't really an indication of the market in a positive or a negative way. There are way too many factors, and um, I think this year there are quite a lot of very interesting factors that Joshua has pointed out that have led to this result that we have right now. In the past, whenever we had an announcement from the US or any big economy that they were going to put together a plan, not even saying that there was going to be a certain act, but very specific stipulations, just to put together some form of framework or plan that's not yet set in stone, that was already a bullish enough signal. And it usually coincides with the market being in quite a good shape. But right now, the market cycles seems to have shortened quite significantly. The volatility of the market is substantially higher than it used to be. At the moment, we are experiencing an a certain uptick in the market, but people have become very, very cautious at the same time. There's way too many wars going on, narrative wars, I would say, and it's not as clear as it used to be, where in 2021 and 2022 it was very clear that that was the time to get into crypto. Coincidentally, it was during COVID, so everybody was locked indoors. People needed to find alternative ways to make money, and a lot of people lost their jobs around that time too. Coincidentally, it was during the Biden administration, and it was quite a perfect storm that led to what we have right now.
Well, I would just add that if we look at the previous cycle at 2021 and 2022, there was also a period where Elon Musk had a lot of tweets, which initially had a lot of market movement, but he also suffered something similar to what I would try to coin as a pump exhaustion. And we had seen similar effects earlier this year, where Trump came into office. It was a lot of bullish sentiments initially, but after so many executive order and all that attempt to basically keep the price up, there was a period of huge and significant market correction. Notably, when the tariffs were announced, you saw crypto actually retreating back to 75K, which was actually the same price that I called when Reuters was interviewing me earlier in the year. Again, we're seeing quite a bit of exhaustion in this cycle, and at this particular time, and and we don't know. We just had a minor correction this past week, which gave some bearish sentiments as well on the market, and the risk will be there. The question is, what will be the domino effect? In the last cycle, we saw the collapse of FTX, which led to the collapse of Three Arrow, and basically the domino continues. In this particular cycle, I think we're seeing MicroStrategy, huge BlackRock jumping into Bitcoin, and there were already warnings. If there's a huge market correction, these large institutions can suffer tremendous losses. And a lot of times people always have this blindsided because they see these organizations as too big to fail. FTX was the second largest crypto exchange until overnight it wasn't. So these are the intrinsic risks that we're seeing, that is basically whether there's a contagion effect in the markets is something that a lot of analysts will have to look out for in the coming days.
All right. So, Josh, what's unsettling is the relatively light touch approach taken to regulating meme coins. And I guess what I'm wondering is, does again, relatively watered down regulation of meme coins, does it encourage innovation, or is it, simply put, just exposing investors to more undue risk?
Now, I haven't seen any FATF agenda targeting meme coins per se. Meme coins, again, as I've said, really kick off to 2024 to 2025. But since then, we had the Huak Tour Girl token that actually became quite controversial. And on top of that, we had the 13-year-old kid that scammed or rug pulled tens of thousands of people from the ecosystem because of lack of regulation. Of course, in today's current climate, aside from FATF indication, you're not going to see a SEC going to be very tough on meme coins. I can't foresee it, especially given the fact that there's a Trump and Melania token floating around, right? So the only thing that they have done is share circular saying, meme coin has no intrinsic value whatsoever. And so long as they state that clearly, it's outside the scope of regulatory ambit of the SEC because it's not securities. How related laws develop across the world in other jurisdictions remains to be seen. I would say it's too early to tell, but if enough people get hurt as a result of meme coins, certainly there'll be much more stringent rule. It doesn't have to be rolled up in the US first. It can be in a number of jurisdictions. For example, when Mika came out in the EU, we have seen reverberating effect within the cryptos ecosystem already. And it might just be the Europeans that will be the first to regulate, and with other jurisdiction following certain standards. Do they come in at the money laundering and counter-terrorist financing angle? We don't know yet.
There's a lot to be decided in this space for sure. Last question, given the time we've got left, how can, and this is, a bit of a more international in scope, more macro. So if we look at it from that perspective, how can projects effectively balance innovation with regulatory compliance amid differing US and Asia Pacific frameworks?
Well, I'll just start by saying that the balance is actually not that difficult. A lot of times when you see a lot of these regulatory standards being imposed, it's really just to have guardrails, just to ensure that when people do suffer loss as a result of certain intentional malintent actions of certain parties, they will have legal recourse. And that's why a lot of these AML standards came about. But as for how it might not stifle innovation, well, interestingly, what innovation have you really seen in crypto, right? I will invite Melissa to list out a few. Not a lot has really evolved. We had the first meme coin, Dogecoin, came out many, many years ago. Has there been a lot of widespread innovative adoption? I have not personally. I've not seen the smartphone precipice yet. Keeping in mind, the internet was called a fad until the smartphone became widely adopted, where everyone is using it. Crypto, aside from tokens, haven't really grown out of it yet. But subject to what Melissa might have to add.
Melissa, you have the last word.
Right. Well, I think it's such a overdone statement to say that when there are further implications with the law and regulation, that would mean hampering innovation. Rather, I think whenever regulations are in the conversation, it's mostly about how communication is done from a project point of view towards the general public, and at the same time from the project point of view to the investors. I think that's where regulations would really matter. For instance, in certain jurisdictions, you're not allowed to promote your token in a certain way. Perhaps you're not allowed to use public flyers offline, which means like banners and big signposts on the street. They're probably not allowed to do that in some jurisdictions. It's very similar to how on Twitter, now called X, you can't really say giveaway anymore if you're going to do some type of raffle, because there's a lot of implication legally as to what that might entail, and you're gonna have to list a bunch of disclaimers that have to do with that. But at the same time, you can't really escape doing some form of incentivized activity. So then we have to name it not an airdrop, not a giveaway, not anything related to that. We say it's a contest, so that you have to earn your way into getting that incentive. And I think this applies to how do you see yourself innovate in this space, bearing in mind that there will be more regulatory clarity from a product point of view. I've not seen that be a hindrance or an issue. It is really more about the narrative behind it and how are we going to be able to maximize the reach of a project if there are certain regulatory concerns in big markets where coincidentally you really want to hit that market. That's where it matters.
Joshua Chu Melizza Anievas, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.